Oh, God. Okay.
All right.
Ready?
Ready.
Hey, Barry. Good morning. How you doing?
Good morning, Michael. How are you doing today?
I am approaching this with both optimism and trepidation. We
That's
are,
our constant state of being, though, isn't it? That's our constant state of being. Optimism, yet trepidation. I
yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
I'm
That could
getting.
be our motto,
It could be.
our Twitter handle.
I don't want a Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Anyways, so we're back. This is round two of the Horkheimer and Adorno experiment that we are calling or they called the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and we are going through. So today the plan
Yeah.
is to talk about Odysseus, and you and I have decided that rather than try and handle the entire chapter, what we're going to do is discuss Odysseus as Enlightenment man, through three specific points, right? We're going to look
Mhm.
at Circe, the Cyclops, and then his return home and the encounter with the suitors. So
Right.
we're going to talk about those three things, and then ideally we will stop and take a look at how this looks in 1940s.
When they're writing, when
Right,
Adorno and
and
Horkheimer
then
are
and
drafting the Dialectic of Enlightenment.
right, and then probably, and I guess try and take a stab at seeing how well Odysseus's Enlightenment man works now.
Right.
So let's jump in if you're ready. If you got anything to add, or shall we?
No, I think we can jump in. I guess we should I say just a little brief bit? Maybe I can talk briefly about what we're not talking about.
I think so.
Okay. Um, so there's a long, we're having to be, we're silly enough or foolish enough or whatever we are enough to talk about. And I think we're kind of committed and kind of jazzed about the idea of using this as our first extended discussion of an extended work, right?
Mm-hmm.
A multi-part episode, multi-part podcast that discusses a longer work in depth. So, but necessarily, even to do this, there are this book is so rich in ideas that we have to, as Michael said, touch down at a couple places. And so we're going to touch down at a couple scenes, a couple key scenes that from the Odyssey, that we think that if we discuss their interpretation, the Adorno Horkheimer interpretation of these particular episodes in the Odyssey, we're going to give some insight, hopefully, into the Adorno Horkheimer framework and their arguments about enlightenment and mythology. So just a brief word about what we're not talking about, since we'll mostly be focusing on the plot and the Adorno Horkheimer interpretation of the plot events of the narrative of the Odyssey. There is a long excursus about sacrifice that I'm going to try to summarize very quickly. There's a long excursus about sacrifice, and rather than and it's fascinating, but rather than deal with it here, unless viewers and listeners feel that this is worth its own particular podcast, in which case we'll do it, but only if you prompt us. But just to give a kind of quick summarize, because it's a pretty large part of the chapter. The function of this larger discussion of how sacrifice and ritual work in the Homeric age, but also in the pre-Homeric age, the function seems to be this. It corresponds with this part of the argument that Michael and I discussed last week. There's a dual project going on in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. First and foremost, I don't know if it's first and foremost, but it's definitely primary, is this argument that we are going to be talking about more today about how enlightenment undoes itself, how the Enlightenment project and how Enlightenment heroism, in this particular case, how Enlightenment heroism contains its own mythic, barbaric, uncivilized, however you describe it, element. So that Enlightenment, what Adorno and Horkheimer are trying to do is detach the notion of enlightenment from automatic progress and linear progress toward a greater state of civilization or reason. Okay, there's that. But the other part of their project is to say, hey, you know what? Enlightenment is always bagging on myth. But when you look at it, when you look at myth more closely, myth and ritual, and even, they argue, sacrifice, has a logical structure that looks a lot like enlightenment. In fact, in particular, and this is the setup for the chapter. I'm almost done with it
Yeah, you're
because I
fine.
want to get to the episodes, but the setup for the chapter is very congruent. I'm mentioning it because it's really congruent with their project in the book, which is to say that we've kind of misunderstand enlightenment, especially when we understand enlightenment as a thing and not as a process. We tend to overlook the fact that enlightenment, there is no automatic link between enlightenment and process and progress. That said, another problem with fetishizing enlightenment is that we lose or miss or overlook the rational elements to even something that looks irrational, like sacrifice. So, bring it to a close. They discuss Odysseus in specific relation to this. This is how they begin their chapter. It's very congruent with, consonant with their project. We're going to talk about the second prong of their argument, but they're true to their argument, and they open up the chapter by saying, "Hey, look, ritual and sacrifice, it looks as if it's pre-rational, that it doesn't belong to, say, rational modes of thought, including economic exchange. But take a look at Odysseus rather, in the Iliad, and also in the Odyssey. Odysseus is trying to gain. He doesn't believe in rituals, except he knows how to exploit them. And he uses ritual as an enlightenment man, and we're going to talk about what that means. But he uses ritual as an enlightenment man would. He's trying to game it. He's calculating. And their point in the first part of the chapter, Adorno Horkheimer's point, is there, as they will do throughout the larger project, they want to underscore that, hey, you know what? We misunderstood enlightenment. We also misunderstand mythology and the ritual world and the sacrificial world. There's an element of enlightenment that's kind of latent in the pre-Homeric world. Okay.
So you bring up an interesting question for me that I hadn't considered before, that I want to just take a second to poke at, because I think that if I'm hearing you properly, this is an interesting sort of consolidation of the arguments. So
in this you're saying in this excursus, there's a way in which the chat. Yeah, I think the chapter is
I think
trying
so.
to
I think so.
consolidate.
So
Right.
this distinction about a pre-rational state and the misunderstanding that enlightenment and myth, the basically the argument that those two are distinct or different in
Distinct
some way
realms. Right.
is problematic. But as it relates to Odysseus and his journey, not so much his journey as it relates to Odysseus and the navigation of his journey. And so we've identified three moments that we're going to talk about in particular. But I think it's interesting to maybe I want to see if I understand you properly. Odysseus, excuse me, is the embodiment of enlightened man, right? Like he is cunning, he is insightful, he is able to think his way.
He's calculating.
Calculating.
His insight and his rationality is almost the same as calculation.
But right? you said something really interesting there. And I think that you said that he uses ritual and myth, right?
I think that's their argument.
And so to me, I think is that Horkheimer and Adorno making a move to clarify the argument that these are not two distinct perceptive place, or not perceptive. What am I saying? That these are two different ideological positions.
Modes of thought. Yeah, no, you got it.
So the argument here is that Odysseus, as enlightened man, is able to leverage myth and ritual.
Love that verb. That's the exact verb. I think that's
okay. Right. So I think that's a really helpful sort of foundation to to use, because we're going to talk about all of the ways in which Odysseus is enlightened, understanding that his ability to behave as enlightened man is due largely to the fact that he can still, traverse in the currency of myth.
Exactly. Right. Well, very well put. A final point on this, because it segues very nicely into our discussion of the supernatural elements. So remember, I don't think Adorno Horkheimer believed in an actual person named Homer, but there were Homeric storytellers. But key to their reading is that it isn't just Odysseus who's calculating. Key to their understanding that the Homeric bards kind of had this, whoever they were, they had this insight that is attributed to Odysseus, that that ritual can be gained, can be leveraged. Crucial to that is that it isn't just, this is one of the most fascinating things in the first part of the chapter. It isn't just Odysseus who, Adorno and Horkheimer are very clear. They say, look at how Odysseus navigates, to use your verb. That's the operative verb. Look at how he navigates the landscape. Interestingly enough, they note, who's the presiding god? I guess there are two major gods who are involved in the Odyssey. There's Athena, who's presiding over and protecting Odysseus,
right?
And the other one is Poseidon. And their characterization, Adorno Horkheimer's characterization of Poseidon in the novel, in the epic poem, is really key, because they say, Odysseus is calculating, but that if you look at Poseidon and how the god interacts with Odysseus, he's a sailor too. He's calculating. He just wants his reward. He wants his tribute. There's no sort of like supernatural, idealistic, moralistic patina or coloring to Poseidon. He's a gamer too. So he's a sailor writ large. He's a calculating, like Odysseus. He's a god of the seas. But what's his mentality? Not necessarily a divine, not something that a sailor wouldn't recognize. He's calculating too. So this idea that ritual can be gained isn't just attributed to the Enlightenment hero. The gods know it too. In the case of Poseidon, now I think it's more complicated, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this. I think it's more complicated with Athena. But with Poseidon, their point is, look at the Poseidon character and how he's represented. He's up for the game. He's ready, and he's ready to be leveraged. If Odysseus knows how to leverage him, he's there. He's ready to be leveraged. He doesn't want higher tribute.
Okay. I don't know where to go with that just yet.
No. I mean, this is just stage setting. Now we're going to talk about the second part of the argument, right?
Right. So let's jump into that. The idea here is that we're going to look at Odysseus's encounter with Circe, the Cyclops, and then the suitors. So, so we'll start with Circe. And do you want to jump this off? You want
to? I guess I could. Or do you have a? It will take me a moment. So if you have something immediately in mind, maybe you can jump in. But if not, I'll do it. It doesn't matter. Should we stop? Yeah.
Okay, let's stop. Sorry. That's okay.
What should we do?
My note with Circe is well, hold on. First of all, let's put a little.
Well, you know what? I mean, you can just tell me that.
I'm okay. I was just marking the
the
thing.
Good.
My note here is can't let go of the past, resist the future, must be overcome by enlightenment hero to progress. How do you want to start this? I don't know how we're getting into it.
Well, no, I think we should ask. I think this is a good place to stop and just sort of say, how do we want to do it? Do we want to have a consistent structure? Do you want to always ask me do you want to give me the first comment, or do you want to make the first comment? Okay, we'll do it.
Okay, so are you ready?
We'll start it again. And okay, no, I'm not ready. Oh yeah, I am ready now.
Do we have the text? Do we have a quote from the text?
Yeah, I do. Self-preserving reason cannot present cannot
Okay.
permit an idyll. I'll go to that.
Okay. Okay. So you ready? We'll go
Yeah.
silent and then we'll.
Sure. You're going to ask me the question, right? Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna, in looking at Odysseus as Enlightenment man, we're gonna focus on three of the encounters. There were more. Obviously, it was a toss-up whether or not to include the sirens, but
Sirens, right?
that sacrifices must be made. So we're gonna start with Circe, and why don't you start us off?
Well, I'll start us off, but actually, why don't I include the sirens in here as well? Because the reason why we weren't going to talk about the sirens specifically, and we felt that Circe would do for our purposes, is because both characters, in the case of the sirens, what's dangerous, quote unquote, to the narrative, what's dangerous to Odysseus in the narrative, is the siren song. What does the siren song do? What is art's danger within the particular economy of the text? The danger is Enlightenment man. The problem is Enlightenment man has a purpose, and the Enlightenment man, the Enlightenment hero, must stick to their purpose. Their consistency and determination is what determines their heroism. That depends, that's the qualification, or I guess the prerequisite for being recognized as heroic. They have to maintain a kind of monomaniacal commitment to self-preservation and self-interest, but also this kind of self-preservation. The manic focus, the monomaniacal focus on achieving your goals is dark side of enlightenment for Adorno and Horkheimer. So within that context, and Odysseus represents that. So within this context, we can talk about both the sirens and Circe. In a sense, these very different characters, they present Odysseus a particular problem, in that in one case, the siren song, art in other words, encourages Odysseus to stop what he's doing and do nothing. And the charm of the, not just Circe, but also of the Lotus. Yeah.
Well, it's not so much that it's not that you arguably, yes, do nothing, but it's not even do nothing. It's look to the past and dwell in the past. So right. it's not right. So. So my question, because I think that this is really key to the discussion of Circe, is it's not so much. It's two things. It's one, that art keeps us from moving forward
in the siren's case,
in the siren song, but it does so by actually pulling us backwards. I mean, it does not lure Odysseus into a stupor. It doesn't make him indifferent. It would drive him to actively seek the past, which is contra to the Enlightenment job of moving forward.
Progressing, right? In a linear fashion. No, that's a great distinction. It's a particular kind of art, is a particular kind of narcotic, right? We're going to talk. I mean, the Lotus Eaters, quite literally a narcotic episode. Circe, in the sense of stop the forward movement and just stay sexually satisfied. Mired. That would be the logic of the text. That you're mired and chained to your desire, which keeps you chained to the moment, right? That's the particular kind of constraint.
But it's but it's still a return to something. It's never moving forward.
Well, you make me question that. I was thinking that you make me question that, Michael, with your remark, because I thought, and I like this idea. I thought you were saying, these are the same. And the reason why we mostly wanted to talk about Circe is we felt that by talking about the Circe episode, we were kind of talking about these other episodes and the Adorno-Horkheimer argument about these separate episodes. That said, I very much like your point that there is something distinct about art, in a sense that Homer tags art in a very specific way, and Adorno and Horkheimer are sensitive to this. So let me see if I can do this quickly. Lotus Eaters, it's about being enchained or imprisoned, not able to move forward because you're in the moment. Circe, you're so involved in your own pleasure that the male is so involved in male pleasure that he cannot move forward. Yes, I thought this was a great point you were making. Yes, the problem of the siren songs, the problem posed by art, is that it hinders forward movement. But with art, I think there is something different, right? It's this idea that you're mentally kind of pushed back to the past, and
Mm-hmm.
that you're mentally regressing. You're regressing in a kind of specifically different way. And does that make any sense? I thought that was kind of behind your comment that
Well,
art, there's something a little bit distinct about what happens with the siren as opposed to the Circe.
I think there is a distinction, but both of them challenge or frustrate the Enlightenment mission of moving forward. I think the question is, which do they do? So to me, the siren song is a return, a reflection. I think there's a conscious pull to it. It is not a
Pull to the
state
back, pull to the past.
pull to the past. Whereas I think that if you look at Circe, that to me, that's hedonism.
Yeah. I
That's
agree. I agree.
dwelling in this moment.
Mhm.
It so that art still does something. I think art is dangerous to enlightenment in a way that is different
Yeah, I agree.
than just self gratification it's a different engagement. And I think that it's interesting because the siren song, the art, prompts a more violent response.
Yes, right, right. He has to be physically bound.
Right. So, did you want to take a look at the text so we can?
Well, there's just a kind of I was thinking we could wrap up. I only have a sentence that I would refer our readers and listeners to,
Okay.
or our listeners and viewers to, that I think kind of sums up the discussion. I very much like the fact that you brought up that important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
We were making a conflation for time's sake and economy's sake, but your distinction is a very important one, and I'm glad we got that in there. So the key sentence among that we feel kind of uh, tags this or brings this punctuates this argument is that is an aside or is a brief statement that Adorno and Horkheimer make on page 4. I believe it's on page 49. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Of the Stanford edition of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Self-preserve, and this is in specific relation to Circe, but
Mm-hmm.
in a way, in a qualified way, it can stand for an explanation of the Sirens episode, but also the Lotus Eaters episode. So here's the line: self-preserving reason, as embodied in Odysseus, cannot permit itself an idyll. It can't permit itself a rest or a moment of stasis. It can't go back, and it can't linger in the moment.
Right.
And
We
yeah.
must continually march forward.
Shall we march forward to the
No, I'm sorry.
Cyclops?
If you want to finish it.
No, that was it.
Okay.
That was my flourish finish. So I'm ready to go to Cyclops.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Let's just pause for 1 second and say that
Yeah.
in terms of Odysseus as Enlightenment man and um the distinction between myth and enlightenment.
Yes.
The takeaway from Circe is that, and the sirens, as we had talked about, is that their enlightenment thinking does not allow for a pause, and it certainly will not allow for regression.
Regression. Right.
Right. And so and Odysseus's ability to resist these, his cunning is a display of, what would you say, thinking, right?
Right. Enlightenment thinking.
Enlightenment thinking. But he is able, because he is versed in myth, he knows how to resist these. So you see there the interweaving of myth and enlightenment thing. He fills dual capacities there.
That's a great additional insight there. Your last point. What was the word you used that I also want to underscore because it's the perfect word? Just a brief elaboration on the. You said this perfectly. I'll just add a little fillip to it. Homer presents the move back to the past, dwelling in the past, even if it's embodied in art, right? There's no sense that art is a separate practice from everyday life. If art embodies a look backwards in this novel, the Enlightenment casts of this novel, character of this, I'm sorry, not novel, but epic poem. Although there are many novelistic episodes, I mean, this is an epic poem that really does read like a novel for interesting reasons. But Homer seems to be at pains, the Homer poets seem to be at pains to present the moment of looking backwards as a regressive moment, as a like looking backwards can only be within this Enlightenment scheme. It's tantamount to regression.
Right.
It's a negative process. It seems to be, it's presented as uniformly negative. How's it uniformly negative? It's always, as you say, regressive.
All right. So onwards to the Cyclops
And
barbarism.
And maybe am I wrong to say, or is it too presumptuous or pretentious to say this is kind of a simple bit of their argument? Here's the key quote on page 51 in the Stanford text. The Cyclops are fierce. I'm not even going to read the whole sentence. I'm just going to read this cap of the first part of the sentence from Adorno and Horkheimer. The Cyclops, this is a quote, part of this is a quote from Homer. The Cyclops are fierce, uncivilized people. And Adorno and Horkheimer go on to say, well, wait a minute. Uncivilized people? What's uncivilized about it? What does that mean? That means they're regressive and true to form, true to the character, the Enlightenment character of the Odyssey. Uncivilized means you're backwards. Compared to what? Well, these people don't work. Cyclops don't work. They don't cultivate. So compared to up-to-date modernity, Enlightenment modernity of agricultural modernity, they have to be. They are stereotyped. They inevitably have the character. They're inevitably presented as fierce, uncivilized people.
So if you actually, I want to expand upon this quote just a bit, because I think that you have sort of built in a nice little bridge from Circe to this in terms of, again, following the path of enlightenment here. Just before that line, he says, for Homer, the definition of barbarism coincides with that of a state in which there's no systemic agriculture, therefore no systemic time managing organization of work and society has yet been achieved. So for him, as you said,
very much for reading that. That's crucial.
So for him, as you said, barbarism is unstructured, but it is unstructured in ways that don't maximize the efficiency of work. Exactly. And so, in other words, it's idle. It's
idle, and the problem with Circe is that that presents an idyll in his heroic, progressive journey.
Right. So, there you go. There's the Cyclops in 30 seconds.
Well, that's what I meant by simple. I mean, once you catch their logic, it's very, it's hard to argue against, right?
It is, but again, you see here in this moment, how does Odysseus's overcoming of the challenge to enlightenment relies upon his cunning and his ability to understand the limits of myth. In fact, there's an interesting sort of the side bit to this is, he said, what was it? No man.
Oh, sure.
Right. So he introduces himself as no man, but then he ultimately screws himself because he can't bear the thought of not taking credit for overcoming.
I want you to know it was me.
That's it. That's so I wonder if this is obviously not something that necessarily fits this discussion, but the role of ego here, the desire to elevate oneself and the cost of that, I think
isn't that, that's the underside of the heroic idea. is that you end up elevating an individual ego when you say it's a hero.
Right.
You encourage that person.
That's the return to myth.
That's
Right.
return, and that's the return to myth. That's brilliant. Yeah,
and
that's
that
a brilliant observation.
and we punish that
Yeah.
with a few more years at sea sailing in circles, and this is what you get. So which he again still manages to overcome. So yes, I think there we go, there's the Cyclops in a nutshell.
Well, well, shall we? Yeah, wonderful. I love that last comment that you added. Well, let's just go to what I think is the most brilliant reading of all. Because, and I say most brilliant reading because it's been a while since I read the Odyssey. I would say at least 10 years. I think I had to reread it for some other purposes, but it's been at least a decade. But this is, to me, the most brilliant. This is the most brilliant of their readings. Adorno, and I'm grateful to Adorno and Horkheimer for revealing to me how deeply creepy and disturbing and underscoring the horrific violence of Odysseus's homecoming, which is really the final part of this particular excursus of this particular chapter. They note, hey, take a look at what Odysseus does when he gets back. It's all about not just returning to his wife, but it necessarily necessarily scores have to be settled. Scores have to be settled. Justice has to be measured out. Revenge must be calculated and absolute. In other words, what does Odysseus do? He brings enlightenment war, enlightenment man, enlightenment carnage back home. He brings war back home. And what specifically is allowing, I think, I would argue, I think I would argue that Adorno and Horkheimer's point is the Enlightenment hero. Definitely, it's fun to read about their exploits when they're not at home. When they get home, yeah, you want them to get home, obviously. This whole novel is I keep on calling it a novel, but the whole epic poem is about this moment of closure. But what Adorno and Horkheimer remind us, or at least remind readers who were too stupid when they read this to notice it, is how bloody and how violent, how it is, homecoming is. And in a way, and I think their larger point is the violence that was inherent. I would say it's covert, but it's actually pretty explicit and it's pretty overt elsewhere. But it continues in another overt it continues overtly and clearly in the last in the episode that brings the epic poem to closure. So I'll just read the chilling sentences. Adorno and Horkheimer get full chill on this bit, right? They're brutal. And they're trying to capture and remind the reader, like I said, readers like me who are too obtuse to really process this. They're reminding us of the sheer brutality of Odysseus' return, that it's as if the bloodshed of war has to continue in the home front. So these are, do you want to read this passage on 61 if you have it there, or I can start reading it, but I think
Go ahead if you got it in front of you.
Well, I have part of it in front of me. I don't have the full bit, but I'll try and wing it. Adorno and Horkheimer note the fate of the hanged victims. The fate of the hanged victims is described and expressionlessly compared in the Homeric text to the death of birds. So the dead bodies, dead birds, all the same. Hanged victims, dead birds, all the same in Homer's scale. And imply, in the implied scale of the epic poem. And Adorno and Horkheimer also describe this part of the text as having the, quote, the coldness of anatomy. These descriptions are given with, quote, the coldness of an anatomy and a vivisection. So they're foregrounding, I guess, the violence inherent in Odysseus's epic heroism. In case we missed it,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the question for you. To step backwards for a second, that we might step forward with purpose.
Mm-hmm.
With
Oh,
insights. You like
nicely.
that? You
What?
like
I
that?
love that. Yeah.
I'm sitting on
Let's
that
do
one.
that. Let's
So
do that.
in with the Cyclops, we understand barbarism to be a certain lack of um I don't what's the word I want to use here? A
Well,
lack
they
of
don't want to work.
well, a
They don't want
lack
to
of,
work.
but it's not they don't want to work. It's a lack of organization
Sure. Right.
that can
Right.
measure work, that
Sure.
can structure. So it's a lack of structure. We'll say both time structure, which delineates the work time, right? And then a
Right.
sort of
Well put.
sophisticated, what's the word? My God, words are hard. A technical sophistication,
Yeah.
which then can
Absolutely.
maximize work, right?
Well put.
So if and part and parcel of that is a reliance upon myth, right? The belief that the supernatural will take care of our needs. So if that's the barbarism inherent in
Mm-hmm.
the Cyclops, who is our
Mm-hmm.
emblem of non-enlightenment man, which Odysseus handily triumphs over,
Mm-hmm.
how do you understand violence as a part of enlightenment thinking? Is this simply the aggressive takeover of, the return home, is the return to myth, is the return to the pre-enlightened state, and we must dominate that? Or how do you see this as that? Or do you see, like, I'm trying to situate the enlightenment, the violence of the enlightenment, because
Right.
that's
Right.
counter to how we would normally think of it. And I can think of certain contemporary instances
Hmm.
where there is a violent component to it, but that violence is almost always justified as a necessary means of banishing
As
myth.
as reason. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. It sounds like you have your own. I'll tell you I'll answer just purely. My answer will be only my answer. I sent, and I mentioned that because, and that's stating the obvious, but I say it that way because I sense you're moving toward an alternative interpretation, and I want to hear it. But I'll tell you how I read what happens at the end. Um, I think my reading of Adorno Horkheimer's reading of the end is at the end of the Odyssey is yet another example. I think what they're I think their point about the extreme coldness, vivisection, the extreme violence, and the extreme coldness with which Homer describes the violence, when it's violence wreaked by the Enlightenment hero on characters who are undeserving, right? And who within the moral schema of the poem are found undeserving. I think my reading of this, and I guess my interpretation of Adorno Horkheimer's argument here is this, that the conclusion is of a piece with everything you saw. And now to more directly, with everything we've seen previous to the conclusion. And to directly answer your question, I think Adorno Horkheimer's big takeaway in the Odyssey is this, and they feel the Odyssey is wholly consistent on this point. From beginning to end, Odysseus is rational and calculated. And what that means, so that's what makes him an Enlightenment hero, as we've discussed. Okay, there's a second thing they want to say about that. The second descriptor they want to say about that, okay, if Odysseus is a true Enlightenment hero who literally navigates his journey using reason, calculation, all these things, trying to game the system, he's inherently violent in all. He has a combative, aggressive, inherently violent attitude to the world that sometimes spills out in real kick-ass violence, as it does here. But even where it doesn't, and also with poor Cyclops, right? But even where he's not overtly violent, even where there are not hanged victims that are expressed and described with the quote, coldness of an anatomy or vivisection, even when that's not happening, it's on the verge of happening. It's
Mm-hmm.
possible to happen. It's implicit in the logic. It's part of the logic of his behavior and his rationale of this mindset 24/7. Violence is always around the corner. I think that's my interpretation of what's going on and how, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it sounded like you had a different one though. So,
no,
I like,
I don't know that it's different so much. I think that if you look at every encounter that Odysseus has that he must overcome, there is no negotiation, right?
right. Well, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
overcoming is akin to dominating. And I think that
And
there,
sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not.
right, but domination is going to involve some
Right.
sort of violent resistance. And so I'm trying to piece this together. I think that, you know, his the bloodshed at the end of this is
Mm-hmm.
calculated and surgical.
Oh, absolutely. Right,
And
right,
what
right.
is he doing? He is going
Yeah.
after the indolent and the hedonistic that have been camping at his house, trying to seduce his wife and indulging in carnal pleasure.
And they're eating up his food. They're
And you
also like
get the
using
hell
his
out of my
preserves.
refrigerator. This is what happens. But that's the point, right? He is that what, how
Get
are
out of my fridge. I bought these groceries.
my food? But I think that's the point, right? Like, what are these people doing that is emblematic of enlightenment? Nothing. And this is, I think, very much a case of if you're not a part of this program, you are going to be paved under by this program. So
Beautifully put. Beautifully
is
put.
that
I
a,
think it's totally. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was gonna say I think that's how I read violence as a part of the enlightenment process, is that you are in the way. And if we're after efficiency, if we're after calculation, you don't reason with inefficiency. You
Mm-hmm.
simply fix it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what he's fixed his little problem.
He's fixed his problem. Yeah, and he's a problem solver. That Odysseus.
Let me tell you
Um,
right here. The
um,
fixer.
he's the fixer. He's the fixer. That's a wonderful point. I have nothing to add to it.
All right. Well, Barry, I think that this was, what can I say? Onward to Juliet next time.
Onward to the Marquis de Sade. Absolutely.
All right. Well,
I'll bring whips and chains. I'll have them in the background.
and I'll be grateful that these are done via Zoom.
That we have Zoom.
So
You have
okay.
Zoom protection. It's all
Well,
good.
thank you as always, and again, to those
Thank
of you
you,
listening and
Michael.
watching, like, subscribe, comment, engage, and thank you. We'll do this again soon.
Thank you very much, Michael. Bye bye.